Welcome to Nonprofit Nerd Impact Unleashed. Get ready to dive into the world of nonprofit leadership and sustainability, where the passion and unstoppable dedication of those making a real impact are celebrated. With your host, Jarrett Ransom, get ready to explore inspiring stories and game changing strategies of nonprofit leaders from across the sector. In this season, we're focusing on critical management challenges that are key to the long-term success of nonprofit organizations. Nonprofit Nerd Impact Unleashed is your go-to podcast for no-nonsense, in-depth conversations with the real-life superheroes of the nonprofit sector. Get ready to unleash your inner nerdiness and learn how to navigate and overcome the challenges that help build stronger, more sustainable organizations. Now, let's dive in and harness the collective power of our nonprofit networks to create lasting change.
Hello there, fellow nonprofit nerds. I am thrilled to share with you today's guest, Christopher Huntley. Chris joins me from Chazin, and he gets super nerdy with me about all things financial. Chris and his teammates at Chazin, they work exclusively with nonprofits across the nation. And in this conversation, Chris encourages you to identify and quantify risks, but he also reminds you not to be scared of them. He acknowledges the fierce loyalty that our sector has and the individuals that make up our community champions. Before we dive into this conversation, I want to give a shout out of gratitude to this season's podcast sponsors. Thank you to Bloomerang and thank you to Chazin. Your support in these conversations are greatly appreciated. Okay, Chris, I am honored to have you back. We met, gosh, it hasn't been that long ago. We recently did a panel, and from there, I was like, we've got to have more conversations about this. So for all of our listeners, please help me welcome Christopher Huntley to the conversation. And Chris, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Well, Jarrett, thanks for having me today. I really enjoyed our conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I've been looking forward to talking with you more since then. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a lot of people are listening. Some people might have found us on YouTube and are looking and seeing your title and where you're with, but share a little bit with all of our listeners, Chris, who you are, what you do, a little bit about Chazin. Of course, they're an amazing sponsor of the podcast as well. So there's been a little bit of nuggets of who is Chazin, right? But you work there, have worked there for quite some time. So yeah, dial us in.
So I work for a firm called Chazin. We are a national firm. We provide sort of 360-degree financial accounting, bookkeeping services. We are exclusively in the nonprofit space. And then I personally lead our fractional CFO and advisory solutions practice.
And that is so important. And I love the word fractional. I've taken it on too with some of my services, but maybe some of our listeners don't know what that is. Will you share what that fractional, CFO looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So we provide a little bit of a counterpart, a little bit of a difference to what you think of as accounting and controllership. So when I talk to prospective clients or even current clients, the controllership and accounting work is all retrospective in nature. So you're looking at, last month's financials or last quarter's board report or, the audit for last year. And the CFO element of that is more prospective. So we're looking at next year's budget, the 5-year plan. We're doing financial modeling around a new product or a new program. But those two really dovetail together nicely, right? So the quality of the financials, the retrospective work really informs the analysis that you do looking forward. And then the quality of the budgets and the strategic plan really make that kind of transactional work, recording and reporting so much better. And then the fractional side of that, a lot of our clients, maybe they don't need a full-time CFO. They're just not at that level yet. Or maybe they have a full-time CFO, but they've got project work, right? So one that I come up with a lot is budget time. I don't know many nonprofit leadership teams that just have a ton of time laying around. They are focused on their mission. They're focused on their day-to-day. They're focused on working with their board. And then some point, best case scenario, 3 or 4 months before the end of the fiscal year, somebody comes along and says, oh, by the way, collectively, we've got 100 to 120 hours worth of work to do. It's the most important thing that you'll do, but you don't get to put aside anything else that you're doing. And that can lead to mediocre budgets or great budgets, but other work is mediocre. Or worse still, you've got your team leaders that are just burnt out at the end of the process. So that's the kind of project work that we can come in. We can inculcate ourselves into your organization pretty quickly. We can provide that project work, and you're only paying for the services that you use. So that's sort of the fractional side of fractional CFO services.
I appreciate it so much. The fractional work I do is never in financials, right? But bringing in that financial expert is so very critical. And who you are and what you're doing and what Chazin is doing in our landscape right now is so critical and very important. So thank you for that. And let's dive in, because I really want to address, today's economic regulatory landscape. It is different than March of 2020. It is different than, 2018. So I'm really curious, in this landscape, right, both economic and regulatory, what does financial leadership in particular and sustainability look like for the nonprofits that you and Chazin are working with?
If I'm coming into a client with sort of an overarching message, it's that they need to identify risk, they need to quantify risk, but they don't necessarily need to be scared of risk, right? So risk is only scary when you don't know what it is, when you don't see it coming. And that the work of doing that, right? So they start out with this grand idea. The work of doing that is much more mechanical, and it's a long list. So, the big ones that we talk about in the nonprofit sector. Number 101, do you have, the heuristic is a 6-month operating reserve set aside? And there's a reason that's number 1. That's probably the best thing you can do to prepare for risk. That's your one-stop shop. But now we take that a step further. Well, 6 months, right? Is that really right for your organization? Maybe it needs to be 9. Maybe you can get away with less. But then going even further, saying, okay, well, maybe we haven't thought about this in the past. Maybe this is, we've just said we've got 6 months in the bank that doesn't have a name written on it, so we're good. But now we need to be talking to our boards about, well, what are the scenarios when we would tap into that reserve? How bad do things have to get? What are the specific circumstances? And when do we stop? When do we stop using it? What causes that? And really having that plan in place. Going on from there. The leadership, your program managers, leadership team should really understand your financials in depth. Know every line on your balance sheet, know what assets and liabilities you have, and are these really appropriate for your organization? And that it doesn't necessarily mean, I think a lot of times when the economics look rough, we want to start monetizing the long-term assets on our balance sheet, and that may not be appropriate. I've got performing arts organization clients, and right now, the one thing that I would tell them is the performing arts organizations that are more likely to survive indefinitely are going to be the ones that either own their performance space or at least have exclusive rights to that performance space. And so the idea of, we're sitting on, real estate, we should we should do a sale leaseback or something and monetize that. May be the answer, but it may not be the answer. But the key there is just to really understand it. What do your fixed costs look like? Do you have fixed costs that maybe it's appropriate to convert those into variable costs? If you can do that. Stress test your revenues, right? That's really an important one right now. In fact, that's something that you and I talked about a couple of weeks ago. Do you know where all your revenue is coming from? And do those supporters, whether it's grants or individuals or organizations, what's behind them? I've got clients who they're like, well, we don't get federal grants, so we're fine, but they get state grants. And states get, depending on the state, anywhere from 25 to almost 60% of their revenue from the federal government. So interruptions in federal support have a knock-on effect with the states. Is there just general headwinds coming in the philanthropic community? Are all of your programs self-funding? Are you funding all of your programs, or are you subsidizing them? That doesn't mean it's wrong to be subsidizing a program. Just you should know how much you're subsidizing it for, so you can make those decisions. When you, I mean, the list goes on. I spend all day, but once you start to quantify those risks, you understand what the potential likely bad outcomes are. So
Yeah.
start with that.
Well, I appreciate that you said, like, because I was jotting down some notes, identify, quantify, but don't be scared of risk, right? Like, what I heard of that, Chris, is risk are part of, life. It will happen. It's part of business. Nonprofits are businesses, right? Let's remind all of our listeners that. So, don't be scared of them, but do acknowledge what they are, do the stress test, and then the other thing that I like to remind everyone is, and I kind of say it jokingly, if you know one nonprofit, you know one nonprofit, which means they're all a little different. They all have a little uniqueness. And so really finding out what is best for your organization is, I think, super important in that conversation.
It is. It is. And there's a self-defeat, yes, especially if nonprofits. And I really have two categories of clients. I most of my clients are at least a little uneasy about their near-term prospects. And those that aren't, are the ones who really actually probably should be, right? Everybody should be at least on guard. And there's a tendency to want to hunker down. I think, I say I can predict everything but the future. But I will safely say that the average nonprofit over the next year, let's say, will have fewer resources, or at least those resources will be a little harder to get, and they will probably have more demand on whatever service they're providing. And I think there's a real tendency when you start feeling that way to just want to hunker down. And at worst, that's self-defeating. At best, it doesn't create the nonprofit that you want to be 10 or 20 years from now, if you're talking about sustainability. I was talking to a friend who is an operational leader at a fairly visible nonprofit in my hometown, and the conversation led to the best run organizations, for-profit or nonprofit, that I've ever worked with, have this dichotomy, call it ED or CF or whatever, and these are the moonshot folks, right? These are the big picture. They want to swing at every pitch that comes across the plate. And their principal advisors, maybe that's a CFO, maybe that's a COO, whatever you want to call that title, tend to be almost too pragmatic. They're in the nuts and the bolts. And if all of those individuals are competent and they're dedicated to the mission, they will inevitably respect one another, and that balance and that tension will really work well, and it will temper that CEOs need to go chase down every good idea or potentially good idea that comes along, but will really inspire those pragmatic day-to-day folks to take more risk. And so when I talk about don't be afraid of risk, that's the kind of thing I'm looking at is understand what your current situation is, know where your blind spots are, and then be prepared to go out, because if bad things are about to happen, it won't be the first time. And nonprofits have survived, nonprofits have thrived, and it's that kind of preparedness balanced with a visionary and entrepreneurial spirit are the ones that will be here when we come out the backside of whatever may or may not be coming.
Yeah, that's right. The leaders in our sector, I was talking to another podcast guest, and, often we're very scrappy. We are very entrepreneurial. We're looking at solutions. So I'm curious your leadership style, Chris, when you're working, with your clients, how do you describe your approach to leadership, but particularly in guiding these nonprofits? Because again, Chazin works exclusively with nonprofits through these current financial challenges. How do you show up in those conversations right now?
So not just these conversations, any conversations. In fact, pretty safely, my answer to any question you ask me is going to start with the word budgeting. Budgeting is, I'm an evangelist for budgeting. I love budgeting. I love helping organizations with budgeting. And I think it's the investment you make today that pays off huge dividends, into the future, into your the financial side of your organization. First of all, it's probably the key roadmap to understanding those risks, we were talking about earlier. But it's an opportunity, if it's done right, and often it's not, but if it's done right, to be really transparent and open with your board, with your staff, with your donors about what you're doing over initially the next year and ideally multiple years out. And if you've been clear-eyed and you've clearly articulated what the assumptions are and the trade-offs are, then when you get into those moments where you have to make potentially dire decisions, you really have this roadmap of where to go. And then you can start. If a new program opportunity comes up, or a new investment, or whatever, however you want to phrase that, you know where on your budget your priorities are, if you need to displace something or add something. So that's always where I'm going to go. If you got that right, I'd argue you've got, your 40% of the way.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And what are some other like tangible things, Chris, that you've done, right? You've worked with organizations to help navigate this shift in the economic and the social environment. What are some things that you're sharing in the conversation, Chazin in general, right? Like, what are some of these things to help navigate the shift?
Well, I'm probably 30% of my time right now is just modeling, scenario analysis, stress testing. And in fact, my entire team. And then carrying that a step forward. I don't love this term, the dashboard, but financial information that is fairly easily digestible. There's a point where precision is you're getting a diminishing return. You need to get the big message across, but you need to get it across in an obvious, straightforward, concise manner. So right now, the biggest service I'm offering my clients as a group is being able to take projections and present them. And I have a report that I've really started relying on, and I'd like to think it appeals to all types of thinkers, right? So page one is a narrative, never more than a page. Here's what's going on. Here's what the prospects look like. Here are potential outcomes. Page two or maybe two or three, is a spreadsheet. And then page four, I'm going to put it in graphs. So I think that the best thing that we can do for boards, especially donors, is get the message across, keep it simple, and understand that not everybody's a rectilinear, spreadsheet thinker.
Right. I know I'm not. I am visual. So I would say I'm visual, but I also appreciate the narrative, right? So like, if I'm just seeing numbers on a line, I don't necessarily know how to go from A to Z with that data. But if there's a narrative to interpret the data, how it is meant to be interpreted, and then a visual to accompany and complement that, man, I can push my nerd glasses further up on my nose, right? Because I'm like, okay, I'm tracking, I'm understanding that. So, I imagine there's so many board members right now because we are affected personally as well as professionally, right? So we're showing up around the board table, we're having these conversations, we're driving our mission forward, and we are living in some of the, hardest, most challenging times personally, navigating, it that way. So I love the report, the demonstration that you just provided, Chris, because I can imagine that is like dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's for everyone at that boardroom.
Well, that's the goal. The other one is in terms of approaching leadership is transparency. And again, part of that's off the springboard that's the budget, right? If you've got a transparent budget, you set that conversation. Something that nonprofits have that all but a very few for-profits have is just fierce loyalty among staff, among donors, among the community. And I'm constantly amazed at people who are loyal to an organization, who are loyal to a mission, how much they will put everything on the line for that organization if they're treated fairly and honestly. And I really have, and this is something that's been new in the last 4 or 5 years, really encourage clients to don't be afraid to share if you're facing economic headwinds or operational headwinds or whatever the problem is, don't be afraid to share that with your staff. There's, I think, a concern, and it's understandable that people will want to flee, and your best people are your most marketable, most hireable people, so they'll be the ones that go first, and you're in a death spiral. And that's not true, and that's certainly not true in nonprofits. That good people who are dedicated to the mission, if they're treated with integrity and with and given full information, complete information, that they will rise to that occasion.
Yeah, I've seen it, and I appreciate you acknowledging, that fierce loyalty, because it is here in our sector. It is in so many different ways, right? Volunteers, staff, board, donors. It's like, what more can we do? I'm here to help. Well, I want to shift a little bit into financial efficiency. So, really curious, again, in those conversations, how you're advising our nonprofits at this time to truly balance that financial efficiency with hopefully investing in staff development as well as long-term, capacity building. What do those conversations look like?
Yeah, I appreciate that you've used the term financial efficiency, fiscal efficiency, versus, I don't know, maybe like cost cutting or spending less. There's this, I think fortunately it's mostly died, but there's this old trope that if a nonprofit isn't spending 99.97% of its revenue directly in program work, that they're profligate spenders and con men should be ignored, and that's certainly not true, and that's certainly, I mean, we wouldn't expect that of a for-profit organization, and that's certainly not true. I don't know about you, but I don't know that I've ever encountered a nonprofit, certainly not in my client, in the cohort of my clients, where personnel costs weren't the largest part of the expense section on their financial statements, and often a majority, more than half. And we were talking about risk earlier. Like, that's one of those questions. If we lost an employee, what is the real cost of that, right? Not just the recruitment cost, but you've got the onboarding, the training, and nonprofits have a mission, but the people that work with them are part of that mission. That they are the ones who execute that mission. I had about a year ago, I was working with a client on it was a decent sized client on their budget again, and it was like a $17-18 million budget, and they got down into a question about some software. It was like a $7,000 a year software, and the department manager questioned the efficacy of it. And I'm great. I get to be the neutral outside arbiter. And I went and spoke to the employee, and I didn't know anything about the software, to be honest, but she could really articulate a reason why she needed it. Maybe it was true, maybe not, but it was clear, it was convincing. And I went back to the budgeting team, and I'm like, that software means way more to her than the $7,000 does to this organization, even though they did need to find some room in their budget. And I think that if you take that approach, you find that balance between financial efficiency and employee development, right? And that's really the key to long-term viability.
I appreciate that perspective. And I've been part of the conversations, and it's usually a donor database or a volunteer management database. And it's, can we cut this? Is there a cheaper one? Well, first of all, to transition the data in a system like that should be at least a year-long endeavor, right? So if we are cold turkey cutting it out of the budget and saying, hey, sorry, Sally, that's going to be gone in 30 days, and go with the free one that you can get, Sally's going to panic, right? Like, I will guarantee you that, because there's a lot of institutional knowledge, or I should say there should be a lot of institutional knowledge in a lot of the software and things, of that sort. So I really appreciate so much that perspective, because what I'm also hearing, Chris, is to have the conversation, right? Like talk to the individuals, talk to the staff to say, tell me about this system, tell me about, whatever it is that you're working with. I do think organizational efficiency needs to remain top of mind, but perhaps that $7,000 software investment provides, right, this organizational efficiency where otherwise Sally is not going to be okay and the process is not going to happen. So, and I think that lends itself to sustainability, right? And I'm curious how you, Chris, when it comes to sustainability, how do you define that from a fiscal perspective, mostly that financial perspective, right? What are the key factors that maybe you think organizations should be considering when making these strategic decisions now for a long-term viability?
Yeah. If you'd asked me that question a year ago, I would probably answer something differently, and 5 years ago, something differently still. I think right now, in a word, or resilience or adaptability or something like that, it's the ability to be both strong enough and flexible enough to withstand shocks, whatever that shock looks like. Again, that all goes back to, have you identified and quantified your risks? And I think that that's so important right now. The current administration has completely stepped away from 80 or 90 years of economic, fiscal, and monetary orthodoxy that goes back to Bretton Woods and John Maynard Keynes. And that's an apolitical comment. That's an almost unavoidable statement of fact. If you like the guy, you're all probably like, yeah, it's about time somebody did. And if you don't like the guy, you're worried. But there's no question that where the way things are being approached now is fundamentally different than anything we've done in living memory. And so if anyone's like, when we say we don't know what's going to happen, we really don't know what's going to happen. So I think right now the key to sustainability, right? Well, let's just define sustainability at this moment as, are we around, thriving, and growing in 5 or 10 years? Is that ability to adapt?
Yeah. I appreciate that. And you're right. Like, many of us are living in unprecedented times that we don't have a living memory of this, right? There's history books and there's the World Wide Web. There's definitely information that we can Google our way to. But we're really in a different time. So because we're in a different time, and just general too, I know many of our listeners are going to, really appreciate what you've shared, Chris. Want to say, hey, maybe I want or need a fractional, finance person to join our team, or maybe they need some scenario modeling, some stress testing in and of itself. Maybe they are also sold, like I am, on that report that you mentioned, the narrative, the spreadsheet, the graphs, all of that. So how can people learn more about you, but also about Chazin?
Yeah, so please visit us at Chazin, CHAZIN, and company, all one word.com, or you can email info@chazinandcompany.com. And we would love to start a conversation with you. And if we can't help you, we might be able to point you to somebody who can. Maybe Jarrett.
Yeah. Maybe me. You never know. Yeah. And I'm also pointing back to you, right? Because it's like when they come to me and I say, oh, you need a finance person. I know enough to be dangerous, but here, call my friend Chris Huntley at Chazin. Definitely. Last question, Chris. Is there any final words or takeaway that you would want to leave our leaders and listeners with today?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, if for our friends out there who are running nonprofits, working at nonprofits, Again, like I said earlier, a lot of you are apprehensive, and perhaps you're right to be. Just I remind all of my clients that you're all doing important work. You're all important members of your community, and that work that you're doing is not lost. It's not lost, and it people recognize it would be missed if it was gone. Whatever, whatever that your mission is, whoever your community is, whether it's your local community or a professional organization. So, we don't know what's coming. It's easy to get lost down a rabbit hole, but we've gone through things like this before, and we'll be around. We'll be around when we come out the backside of this, and there are definitely going to be brighter days ahead.
Yes, thank you. That's great final piece of advice. Also wonderful, beautiful acknowledgement that the work our listeners are doing is needed and it's appreciated. It really is appreciated. And we're in it with you. We are here as, a resource. We are here to hold your hand sometimes, create these beautiful reports, to go through all of the opportunities. So Chris, thank you. I appreciate all that you shared. And again, for just, this expertise that you bring to the conversation. Extremely grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarrett. I've really enjoyed joining you today.